Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our 36th Russia-Ukraine dialogue, a series we started following the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. We are part funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Today, we gather to explore the complex dimensions of cybersecurity within the Russia-Ukraine war, and we do so with a heavy heart, yet a profound sense of dedication. This dialogue is not only a platform for critical discussion, but also a tribute to the late Professor Christopher Coker, the former co-director of LSE Ideas, a cherished mentor, a dear friend, and a steadfast supporter of the Russia-Ukraine dialogue series. Today, we honor Professor Coker's legacy by continuing the work he was so passionate about. His unwavering commitment to intellectual rigor and his expertise on warfare serve as guiding lights as we delve into discussions on Russia and Ukraine's evolving cyber strategies, the impact of cyber attacks in the context of conventional war, and the changing nature of cyber warfare. As we gather to explore the complex dimensions of cybersecurity within the Russia-Ukraine war, we are confronted with the stark reality. Recent reports have highlighted the relentless battles Ukraine faces, not only in its physical front lines, but also in the digital realm. The evolving nature of warfare has brought us face to face with the intersections of cyber attacks and conventional warfare, making this dialogue all the more critical. While the concept of cyber war in Ukraine may not have unfolded as some predicted, the country has faced nearly 3,000 cyber attacks this year alone. These attacks, coupled with missiles and drone strikes, have not only weakened Ukraine's infrastructure, but also underscored the need for international cooperation in countering cyber threats. Moreover, the challenges faced by Ukraine's defenders are emblematic of a new era of warfare, where cyber attacks increasingly reinforce traditional weaponry. It is against this backdrop that we convene today to delve into discussions surrounding the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on cyber norms, international cybersecurity coordination, and the critical role of multinational corporations in this evolving landscape. To discuss these issues, I'd like to introduce three very distinguished guests. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Alexander Crowther, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Nadiya Kostyuk, assistant professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. And last but not least, His Excellency Ambassador Tanel Sepp, Estonia's ambassador at large for cyber diplomacy. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the insightful discussion ahead. So I'm first going to turn to Alex. Alex, if you could unmute for us, please. Now, Alex, Russia's cyber warfare efforts in Ukraine were not as effective as some expected. What were some of the key cyber attacks launched by Russia and the lead up to the invasion, and what factors contributed to their limited success? And I also have to ask you, has Russia performed so poorly, or has Ukraine performed so well? Thank you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Leon, for the invitation and for the question. The answer is yes to both. The first lesson we can take is that resilience works. We've been working with the Ukrainians since 2014 to help them build up their cyber resilience. And the other thing is that the Russians are not that flexible. They started the operation the same way they did in Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008, where they start several weeks ahead of time by trying to shut down government services and command and control in the military, and especially leadership with the president and the Congress and things like that. So the Russians just aren't that flexible. They had initial success because they had literally years to prepare for this. But as the battle became flexible, their amount of success has dropped off significantly because they just don't have the capability to do that. And so now they're resorting to mainly information operations and denial of service operations.
Thank you, Alex. That's a great start to this discussion. And I'm going to ask Nadiya to kind of latch onto that to also talk about Ukraine's cyber resilience. Nadiya, welcome again. How is Ukraine managing to maintain its cyber defenses during the war, especially in terms of its critical infrastructure, military communications? What were some of the key strategies and preparations that have played a crucial role in this regard? Thank you, Nadiya.
Thank you for having me. And I think Alex sort of hinted already to the answer, right? We know that NATO countries have been helping since the beginning of the war, and also there has been huge involvement from the private sector. Everybody probably is familiar with Starlink and its main role in helping communication to be sustained on the front line. And there's a lot of debate in terms of whether it should be provided to Ukraine for free, et cetera, which I'm not going to get into this. But as Alex mentioned, the main preparation started back in 2014, right? So it just didn't happen overnight. It just didn't happen when the Ukraine invasion. It started with the help from the Western allies since 2014. It took about 8 years to build some sustainable capability, because back in 2014, when the gray zone conflict in Eastern Ukraine has started, basically Ukraine had nothing, right? I think there was only CERT within the government. There were no agencies. There was no capabilities, etc. We also know that even prior to invasion, back in 2021, in December 2021, also the U.S. Partners, they traveled to Ukraine, they provided software, hardware, they sort of prepared Ukrainian cyber groups, cyber agencies for potential invasion. So it was sort of an extensive effort during the first last 8 years, but also pre-invasion, there was more solid efforts as well.
Thank you, Nadiya. And your description reminds me that what we're seeing in the cyber sphere is almost a microcosm of the war at large, because the Ukraine that Russia invaded in the beginning, in 2014, is very different from the Ukraine in February 2022. So let's turn now to Ambassador Sepp. Tanel, welcome again. Your country, of course, is also at the front line of cybersecurity, so I'm sure you'll have a lot to say. I'd like to ask you, since even before the February 2022 escalation of the war, we have witnessed major cyber attacks targeting Ukraine's critical infrastructure, including electricity grids and hospitals. Now, these attacks have, of course, the potential to result in loss of life. And in light of this, your president recently emphasized the importance of preventing war crimes committed through the cyberspace. Could you provide some insight into the current debate surrounding the demarcation between war crimes and cyber crimes? Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. I'm quite excited to be here and to be talking on this important topic. Let me start by saying that we should end making a kind of difference in between kind of cyber attacks and kinetic attacks. This is all part of one military aggression by Russia. So sometimes I keep thinking myself that we're also talking about accountability in two different silos. We shouldn't be doing that. That, of course, there's a question whether we are ready to start talking about accountability for cyber attacks. And I would say that some of the institutions, especially international institutions, are not ready for that. So we have to take this as one big campaign. And if you allow me just to address slightly on what Professor Crowther said about the effect of cyber attacks. I would argue that for the Russian military campaign, it was kind of a surprise for all of us that there was this Pearl Harbor cyber war. But at the same time, we have to take into account that you have rockets that cause more visual, physical, and psychological damage than any cyber attack. And Russian side simply has still quite many rockets, and so physical destruction of the infrastructure might be more effective tool than taking this down with the cyber attacks. Of course, that leads me back to the accountability question. What is the difference? And I would argue that there's absolutely no difference in terms of legal accountability here.
Thank you. And I think we'll definitely ask some more questions that will latch on to that last point of yours in terms of the difference, but also how other states are seeing it around the world, because of course you have a front seat to those discussions on cyber norms and cyber warfare development. So we'll return to that. Let's first go back again to Alex. Alex, and feel free to comment on anything that the other speakers talked about. Alex, how did international partnerships with NATO member states and the sharing of cyber threat intelligence contribute to Ukraine's ability to defend against cyber attacks? I know you briefly touched on that point, but perhaps you can expand. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leon. That's an excellent question, because I'm actually a cyber advisor for various friendly ministries in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. And so that's actually probably the most important part of what happened in Ukraine. I'd like to first talk about what the ambassador said. It is all one campaign. You can't disaggregate the cyber operations from the military campaign. Indeed, the cyber operations are in support of the military campaign. The United States and NATO does multi-domain operations, where you'll do all of them at the same time. The Russians have a different philosophy where their air, for instance, and their cyber all support the ground force. So it's a different perspective, but it can't be disaggregated. And his point about the rockets and missiles is an excellent one. Indeed, the failure of the Russian cyber campaign is one of the reasons that they started a heavy-duty missile and rocket campaign against Russia, against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. So the partnership thing is big because these countries that just including Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, just don't have the cyber capability, because it's an ecosystem. It's legislation, policy, strategy, plans, and operations. And back to disaggregating, you can't disaggregate any of them. You can't have good cyber operations without good cyber plans. You can't have all this stuff without the legislation to create it and the strategies. And so if you listen to Paul Nakasone, General Paul Nakasone of the commander of Cyber Command, has done lots of interviews over the years about hunt forward teams going to Ukraine and helping out the entire US government. The Pentagon, the Department of Justice, the Department of State all have programs to help allies and partners build their cyber capabilities. And so the Germans have been there, the British, the French, us, NATO, we've all been there since 2014 to do this. Cyber is not a switch. You can't just flick on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity itself is an ecosystem where you have to have cyber hygiene, everybody practicing all that. And so it's a good thing we had lots of time between 2014 and 22, but clearly the Ukrainians did very well at using that time, and all of their partners, particularly from NATO, have done really well at doing that.
My apologies. Thank you, Alex. Let's turn again to Nadiya. Nadiya, if you please. What role have civilian cyber volunteers and the hacktivist groups played in Ukraine's cyber defense efforts, and how have they contributed to countering Russian cyber threats? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, but I also would like to add to the two previous responses, if I may. This is very fascinating discussion. I absolutely agree that if you have a missile, cyber attacks are not going to be as effective. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we've seen an invasion taking place, right? Even when Russia put its troops on the border with Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion that this is just bluff. This is a coercive maneuver. They're not going to invade. But my response to this was, if cyber operations have been so effective, and Russia has been using these operations for the last 8 years prior to invasion, right? We know attacks in 2014, 2015, not Petya. Then why wouldn't it keep using them, right? Why would it need to go with the troops? So again, it's an interesting, I guess, an important point to make there. In terms of the help and cooperation between Western partners and Ukraine, even though there has been a lot of progress made, I think one important point that we need to recognize is that corruption used to be a huge factor in Ukraine, and there was a lot of worries that some of the resources that have been given to Ukraine wasn't used as well as some of the partners had hoped for, even though, again, some capabilities were built, but it wasn't as effective as they initially hoped. And so now we can see that even though Ukrainians still plead for a lot of assistance, they actually say, we know corruption is an issue. Some of the sort of governments or partners or even people might not trust us. You can give us, software, hardware. You can help us with other more tangible things instead of just sending us money that might go somewhere, right? Even though again, it's we are saying there has been improvement in terms of corruption level over the last few years, but it's still sort of a major one of the worries that remains. So back to your question in terms of the civilian volunteers. So I think it's not only just people, obviously, Ukrainians, right? Obviously, Ukrainians who are located in Ukraine, people who are part of the Ukrainian diaspora, but also people who have sort of no relationship with Ukraine whatsoever. But I think this conflict, this war, left a lot of people very not indifferent, right? And as a Ukrainian, I'm very, very grateful to the whole world for helping out. But one of these groups we sort of all know is the IT arm of Ukraine, which has been sort of organized. I wouldn't say managed, but sort of managed to an extent by the Ministry of Digital Transformation. And I think despite all the sort of efforts that has been done by cyber volunteers, there are a few challenges, right? So some of them would try to help, but for instance, that could mess up the cover, that the actual professionals would develop for some time, right? They would get into the system and blow up the cover and the access and etc. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of managing people and training them, but enthusiasm and all the efforts obviously have been super important and instrumental. It's been, I would say, after the war, an important topic that needs to be further discussed, the role of civilians, private actors, all the legality and law around them, etc. But again, I think it's we are all very grateful that they are helping out in this horrible conflict.
Thank you. We'll talk a little bit more about that issue during the next round. Let's talk again about norms development. Tanel, in terms of international law, of course, it's notoriously known for its slow development and for institutions prosecuting international crimes, rapidly evolving landscape of cyber warfare and AI. What specific challenges hinder the prosecution of cyber crimes as war crimes, and what steps should be taken to overcome these challenges? Thank you.
That's an easy question. No, actually, it's not. And it's not an easy question because we do have a recognition from all the countries around the world that international law is applicable in cyberspace. Every country has said that. even the current aggressor, Russian Federation. However, we do still have these gray areas and gaps on how exactly do we interpret international law. And there are some interesting kind of movements going on right now that Russian Federation being at the UN, and I mean I also go to the UN, to the open-ended working group that discusses this international law and threats and other aspects, and I have to say it's one of the weirdest experiences that I have to argue in the same room with the Russians present, and this is just unbelievable what comes out of from their statements. But one of the core issues is that Russia, with the current aggressive behavior, is violating even the UN Charter. That is clear. It's violating all the different international norms. So how is it possible then to even discuss on a normal terms with an aggressor about the accountability? So the movements in terms of international law are extremely slow right now. At the same time, we have an active warfare going on, and obviously we should be talking also about international humanitarian law and how that applies in cyberspace. And there you get already some more countries that are not so clear about this, and maybe want to kind of take a step back. We've seen China indicating these kind of wishes, and some other countries. So it's a really complex area. At the same time, within the European Union, we are really moving forward in terms of the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox, for example. We're constantly trying to think out what could be the extra measures that, as a union, we could take on board and whatnot. But here, I have to say, we still have this elephant in the room, and that is how to really attribute, and how to attribute so that it's core proof. At least within the European Union level, we don't have good court cases that would also direct us to the right direction. And there is more and more information sharing amongst the different countries, but I would say that is not enough. We need even more. We need more robust activities, because this seems to be the only option right now to really get to responsible behavior of nation states in cyberspace. Thanks.
Let me ask you a follow-up question also based on this discussion. Are there any movements by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that you're seeing that they're getting ready to either prepare in the near future to prosecute cyber crimes as war crimes, or do you think it would be largely driven by, say, for example, Ukraine putting something in front of it?
Well, just recently, ICC got hacked themselves, so maybe that will push them to move faster, as a joke, really. ICC, I would say, should be one of the places that should take cyber investigations on board. And I've seen some small movements there, but we are not there yet. ICC is not there yet. There is not enough competence yet. So the big question is, how do we really build this competence? Because you really need judges, prosecutors who have some experience with that. Because collecting evidence is not really different from normal evidence collection, but at the same time, linking the dots with what's happening in technical world to physical world, that is where you really need some expertise. And as I said, that there is not too much international legal practice on this. So that's also one of the hindering points here. But I'm quite hopeful. And I know that there is some information collection going on also in the Ukrainian case, that at one point they will take that on board. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Again, feel free to piggyback on any of that. My question to you is, how has the perception of cyber attacks as a wonder weapon evolved, and what lessons can be learned from Ukraine's experience regarding the limitations and consequences of cyber warfare in wartime? Thank you.
So the other two panelists both mentioned cyber Pearl Harbor, I believe, and essentially that as a concept has been discredited. You know, you just can't create, for instance, 9/11, right? You just can't blow up a building yet using cyber capability. They're working on it, but it's really a stretch. This is why terrorists mainly do information operations and recruiting, not cyber terror operations using cyberspace. There are I call them cyber charlatans out there who will promise anything because their target audience, politicians, don't know anything about cyber. In some countries like Estonia, they have replaced all their senior leaders. Everybody that was a former Soviet got kicked out. And so all the leaders were young and they were able to do the Tiger's Leap program and things like that, which was very helpful for them in the wake of the 2007 Russian operations. But in these cyber charlatans, oh yeah, you want me to take down the grid in Moscow? I can do that tomorrow. And it's just, they make the most outrageous claims about the capability of cyber, and it just isn't there yet. Part of the problem is anything that talks about cyber effects or cyber operations is super classified. It's all top secret, code word, compartmented programs, and so literally, if you're brought into a program, you can never talk about it again. So people know things but can't talk about them. Other people, you know, just don't have the access or don't want to see it because then they can never talk about it again. So cyber effects are a thing. It's hard. Most military leaders are traditional kinetic operations. The Russians are worse at this than most NATO militaries. They're very hidebound. They're very linear and hierarchical and unimaginative and inflexible, as we're seeing on the battlefield today. And so they just can't wrap their heads around the concepts of cyber effects. So they're not doing very well at it. Reference Nadiya's discussion about equipment. Yes, that's a big thing. And so I'm actually working with people who are, you know, it's a parallel effort, and they say, we're going to build you a cybersecurity operations center. We're going to start this fall. We've got the money, you know, and it'll be operational in a year. And then it's up to the partner nation to put together an organization and people who are capable of doing that. Reference Tanel's discussion about the OEG, open-ended working group, and how everybody, including the Chinese and the Russians, have at one time said international law runs red in cyberspace. Yes, they have done that. But you'll notice that the 2015 group of government experts, the Russians and the Chinese, both used the Cubans to dismantle the whole international law runs red in cyberspace. You know, the thing with the Russians and the Chinese, they'll sign anything and they just don't believe it. Look at the Chinese and the South China Sea and you know, international treaties, law of the sea, things like that. Cyber violations. So they'll sign anything, but they don't really believe it. And we can't count on norms and entanglement to be a strong part of deterrence. We're deterred by it. Us, our allies, our partners, NATO, the European Union are all limited by the treaties that we sign, but the Russians and the Chinese aren't.
Oh, it's just on your point that you know, we're not there yet, you know, and your comments on the cyber charlatans, you know, can we expect that the Russians perhaps are holding certain things back also, just because in the cyberspace, of course, once you put something out there, you know, you kind of, it's like a loaded weapon that you fired and you're done with that. A second question, just based on what you said, have you noticed any fundamental differences with regards to the US and EU and Russia and China that's emerged, you know, through this open-ended working group, you know, specifically related to cyber warfare and Ukraine?
So the best work I've seen on cyber warfare would be the Tallinn manual. The Office of the Secretary of Defense, their lawyers at the Pentagon have republished their view of the law of armed warfare, and there's a 15 to 20 page cyber chapter in there. So that's pretty well codified. The Russians aren't hiding anything. They're out of Schlitz, is an American phrase. It's a type of beer, you know, and so literally they're reverting to denial of service operations because it's tried and true, and you don't need to penetrate somebody else's network to do it. You don't need to do a phishing operation. You just ping it from a bunch of different computers. And so they're not going up the ladder of sophistication of cyber operations. They're actually going down the ladder back to the basics. They're in, you know, if you want to compare it to weapons, they're not using nukes. They don't have nukes. They're back to using rocks and bayonets.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, let's move to Nadiya again. You know, earlier we talked a little bit about cyber volunteers and hacktivists with regards to Ukraine. Now, I can imagine that there are concerns that civilian cyber volunteers could be considered quote unquote combatants. Though I would also argue that the Russian military has not hesitated to attack civilian targets without cause. So it should not stop the Kremlin from going after them. Nonetheless, are there red lines for these Ukrainian groups in terms of Russian targets that they are, I don't want to say officially, but officially or unofficially allowed to attack? I know the Ukrainian government has said they have a lot of people knocking on their doors who are keen to become cyber, you know, volunteers and all that. So I'd be keen to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you. That's a super interesting question, and I'm probably not the best person in this Zoom room to answer. I would be curious to see what the ambassador has to say on it. But I think in general, when we think about red line in cyberspace, there's still sort of a lot of debate what it is and how it should be, you know, qualified, quantified, right? Is it about the target itself? Is it about the damage? Is it about all these things? And the main worry is, like, if you define particular red line, then they can always go one level below, right? And so when I think about this war, there has been a lot of red line that Russia and not as many, but some that the US identified, right, in the sense, and some of them have been sort of violated, right? But a lot of them, they are around sort of military equipment and the NATO partnership involvement in this war. Not involvement, but given, for instance, F-16 or a particular long-range missiles, all these different things, right, that Russia sort of have been articulating. But I don't believe, and I might be wrong, that I haven't heard anything concrete in terms of, okay, this target is off limit in cyberspace, right? We know that President Biden has done it back in 2011. I mean, all years is like blurred for me. I think it was 2011 when they had a meeting in Geneva, where he identified 16 critical infrastructure target objects of critical infrastructure, and he said, okay, this should be off limit for the Russian attacks. But nothing like this has been done by the Russian president, at least, again, publicly. I haven't seen this information. So I think something that obviously should be sort of discussed, right, when thinking about this question, is all this involvement of these volunteer groups that sometimes they have all these unintentional effects, and it could be basically they're trying to help out, and sometimes they do more harm than good. So I would say, if I were a Ukrainian government or Western partners, right, who are helping to arrange all these groups, I would be very careful in terms of what kind of access, what kind of types of attacks I would allow them, right, or train them to do. My understanding, it's not a super sophisticated, right? Sometimes they would, I don't know, develop particular software or hardware or something like that. I was like, here, you know, you can use it, but I don't think they would, I don't know, make them hack the power grid in Russia or something like that, and just, you know, put a random person on this. And I do want to add two things to the prior responses about Cyber Pearl Harbor. So that's my sort of favorite, allegory, and also Cyber 9/11. But frankly speaking, I still couldn't understand, even prior to the war, right? Like war helped us discredit it, but prior to war, I was still surprised why we keep hearing all these comparisons. A lot of research, and obviously we use public information, public knowledge, right, or something that has been leaked. We don't have access to classified research, but at least researchers in my community, they tend to agree that cyber war usage of this term is not correctly describes what happens, right? So a lot of it is in the middle, right? We have war, peace, and it's about intelligence competitions, about influence operations. There's a lot of actions, ton of stuff of this happening, but it's not the warfare, right? And I'm happy that, I mean, again, it's very unfortunate that your situation in Ukraine helped us understand it. But when we move forward, people were like saying, we're going to see all this destruction of critical infrastructure. Yeah, it happened with the use of missiles. But also we've seen a lot of influence operations. There was all these psychological attacks, right? They were saying the subway station, there's bomb in the subway station, there's bomb in the train station, there's bomb in the school, right? And people were like, the first few months, they were like, had no clue what was going on. They created a lot of chaos, a lot of, again, psychological damage to the people. So I'm glad, again, that it helped, the war in Ukraine helped to clear this out, but it has been, it has been overdue for a long time. And in terms of whether Russia is holding anything back, I feel like the stakes have been so high, and they've been high for a while, right? We've been discussing the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russians for like the last 6 months. So if they have something really good in cyber, I feel like they would have already used it, right? They've been wanted for war crimes, the crimes against humanity, for all like horrible rapes. I mean, all this, like the highs couldn't be higher, right? So again, I feel like obviously they're restraining themselves. Maybe they have something in the US system, right? Obviously they could be in the networks and system. They are spying, maybe they're lying down, they're quietly. But I feel like they don't have anything of significant value to make a difference in this war. Sorry, it was a little bit long, but I feel like this has been such an important discussion, and thank you for having me.
No, Nadiya, I think those were really great points also, and I do appreciate your analysis on this issue also, that if Russia had greater cyber weapons, it probably would have used it, just given the battlefield dynamics at present and the desperation to show that they're doing something right. So now let's return to you again, and I presume we might have some follow-up questions on this also. But in the aftermath of the February 2022 escalation of the war, major tech companies have assumed diverse roles concerning the conflict, ranging from direct assistance to adversaries to data protection and intelligence support. Does this signify the advent of a new era in the roles played by tech giants in global conflicts? And what direction is this trend taking, and what steps should be taken in terms of norms development, once again, to address these evolving roles and their implications? Thank you. Sorry, that was a mouthful of question, but I hope you got the gist.
Thanks so much. And the role of the big tech, I think this is one of the main game changers. And one of the most significant events that we've seen now. But if you allow me, I want to make 2 points in comments to previous ones, and then I come back to the big tech. First of all, I think we need to look at cyber as an enabler in this military conflict, because if we say that the missile strikes started on 24th of February, then on 23rd of February we had a KSAT case. Russians taking down the military satellite communications that had a major spillover also in Europe amongst the NATO allies. So that was a clear sign of really using cyber as an enabler for military operations. And this is something that will be a trend also in the future. I'm quite sure of that. Hacktivist groups. And this is a really interesting topic, and we've had a lot of experience with activist groups in Estonia also, because whenever Estonian parliament or a government makes a decision on Russia or in support of Ukraine, it's like an automatic thing that we see these DDoS attacks and so on. But we have not paid much attention to this because activist groups are feeding from public attention. So we deliberately have not made any attribution statements, and this has been proving to be a quite good method. So we are seeing less and less attacks. Now, do Russians still have anything yet? Well, quite many people in Estonia says that once Ukraine is more successful in pushing back Russian troops, or there is nothing to fight with anymore, then Russians might revert back to a more kind of cyber tools, because for this you don't need active soldiers. But we'll see if that is good, or if that is happening like this or not. Now, the big tech.
Yeah. Okay, do you mind if I have a follow-up question on this? That the Russians might go. So do you think they're right? Do they have something just holding it, or are they in the process of developing something good and just buying time?
It can be both. And we are in this quite open environment. I know it's a nice people that I'm talking to, but but obviously I wouldn't go to any details on this question. Now, public-private partnership, and then the game changer. I think there are three main aspects here that the private sector has been doing. First, giving direct assistance to the Ukrainian government. Second, helping to migrate sovereign data. And third, as Leon was also saying, our intelligence services are relying more and more on their information. So these are kind of three activities where governments have been used to do themselves. But now we really have the private sector doing that. This is really creating expectations from both sides, from the government side and the industry side. And the question is, how do we now elevate this PPP or public-private partnership concept so that we will meet these expectations? Because there are many questions arising from this conflict. The war against Ukraine, it's really kind of black and white situation. But if it happens to be a bit more grayish area or grayish situation, how should the industry actors then act? What should the governments or the victim expect from these countries? Even from the present war, we could imagine that at one point a board of one big tech company will decide that, okay, we have been doing pro bono work a lot now, but our business interests lay somewhere else, and then who will pay the bill, at what point, at what conditions? So I'm absolutely grateful to the big tech that it has been helping so much, and I'm myself also in contact with these guys quite a lot. But for the future, it raises the questions, and we really need to start talking about these things. And my point is also that we need to expand the public-private partnership to a trialogue with the civil society, because we also need to get them involved. Otherwise, we would not have anybody to keep track on whether we go according to our values or not. For international law bit here, Leon, this will need absolutely another series of lectures because it gets a bit more complicated, especially if we take international humanitarian law and the role of combatants there. This is a question that doesn't have very clear answers yet. In some cases there are answers, and in some cases there aren't. So it's a more really legally detailed discussion that we need to hold on this. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think this recent admittance by Elon Musk that he refused the Ukrainian request last year to activate his Starlink satellite communication network in the Russian annexed Crimean port city of Sevastopol sort of really opened this question of to show that companies have the ability to, in a way, play God in a war scenario, where it has major consequences. So, I mean, it would be interesting to hear how these norms discussions are evolving within perhaps this related philosophical idea of do no harm. I don't know if you want to add your 2 cents to that, or I could also ask the other panelists, but yeah, please. Thank you, Tanel.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that when we have these open-ended working groups where we are supposed to talk about these kind of issues, then Russian Federation has been blocking the presence of Microsoft and some other major players. So how can we have then this kind of more official discussion on this? So we're kind of again in a block situation because of the Russian aggression, and we need to make clear that we all want to talk about these things, and these companies are ready to talk to start talking about these things, but we have clear block from the Russian Federation, and I guess if there was not a Russian Federation, some other countries would block it, but this group of countries it's a clear minority now. So we need to be clear, and Russia is using narrative that there's a marginal group of countries that are opposing speedy kind of advances on the international scene with cybersecurity. No, that is not the case. Russia is clearly blocking many processes right now.
Thank you, Tanel. Now that's really interesting bits of information. Alex, again, let's go over to you. And again, if you want to comment on any of those issues, feel welcome to do so. I want to ask you, the U.S. State Department of Defense has released its 2023 cyber strategy, which emphasizes the importance of cyber capabilities, cybersecurity, and resilience. How does this strategy address the lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, and what key elements can be drawn from it to enhance national and international security? Thank you.
So I'd like to, well, I'll talk about that first. The strategy itself is classified as everything else is here in the United States. Everything is ragingly overclassified in the American system. There's no reason for it to be classified. You can have a classified annex if you want and publish the whole document. So they've only published like a 4-pager, but it talks about what you talked about. And it very specifically says, this strategy reflects lessons learned from the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they are overtly stating that they're taking lessons from there. The two that jumped out at me, the 2 pillars were pertinent to Ukraine, are resilience and partnerships. I don't talk about partnerships because I actively do it. I talk about it because the national cybersecurity strategy signed by President Biden, one of the 5 main pillars is partners. And so you would expect that DoD's cyber strategy would reflect that as well. And so and this goes to what Tanel was talking about with Microsoft. The United States sees allies and partners, and it's kind of like a big network, and like a chain, it's only as strong as the weakest link. And so the whole idea is to take our allies and partners and help each other out. Like I said, the British are doing it, the French are doing it, the EU's doing it, NATO's doing it, Germany's doing it. And so it's really super important to all work together, because what we noticed, for instance, in the very famous Target hack here in the United States, they didn't go through Target system. They went to an HVAC, an air conditioning and heating company that was working, that had contracts with Target to do their HVAC systems, got into their systems, and then because they were a trusted partner of Target, they went up into the Target systems from there, bypassing security, much like going through your unsecure smart refrigerator at home to get into your secure router. And so partnerships and resilience are super important. This is not how the Chinese and the Russians see things, right? They're more standalone. They don't trust anybody. because they know that they're untrustworthy. They don't trust anybody else. I wouldn't belong to a club that would have that man in it type phrase. So they're just not going to do that. Reference cyber warfare and war. War is a political act designed to cause someone else to do your will, and cyber's not strong enough to do that alone. Just like land warfare and naval warfare, you have to bunch it all together. That's why you have nuclear war, right? Because it is strong enough to cause your adversary to do your will. But cyber and war should not go together, because cyber's not strong enough to prosecute a war by itself. But there is cyber warfare, and that's what we're watching here. And now, because back to the Russian flexibility or lack thereof, they're doing things like shut down that radar or shut down that communications node, and they're not using sophisticated penetration things. They're just DDoSing it. They're just taking it down, which is a temporary effect. But if you're doing an operation, if you're flying somewhere and you need that radar to be shut down for 4 hours, it's very easy to do. So that's cyber warfare. And regarding combatants, private sector persons doing cyber and combatants, if they're defending themselves, they're not combatants. But if they're doing cyber offensive operations, you could make the case that they're combatants. And regarding the Russian way of war, it's terror. They try to terrify their target into giving up, and that's why they're attacking the critical infrastructures. They're just trying to scare the Ukrainian population sufficiently to make them give up. Unfortunately for Putin, because he published that article in July of 2021 saying there's no such thing as a Ukrainian, they're really just Russians. He's already threatened them with genocide or with civilizational extinction. And so it's impossible for him to turn the terror rheostat up high enough to scare the Ukrainians into giving up, because he's already messaged that their civilization will end if the Russians win. So terror is just not going to work, but that's their way of war, and that's what they're going to continue to do.
Thanks, Alex. Just in a sentence or two, you mentioned partnerships and the strategic value thereof. It seemed in the beginning of the just in the first weeks and months after the full-scale invasion of Russia, that there of course was a lot of Western support through different institutions and also at a country level support for Ukraine in the cyber sphere. Do you get the sense that everything's become much more sort of mainstream rather than this very fragmented approach? And where do you think is the heart of cyber defense? Are we looking at NATO or where is that?
So NATO only defends NATO networks, and NATO doesn't do offensive cyber operations. So no, they're a player in helping to develop the Ukrainian capability. Cyber partnerships and assistance has been mainstreamed. Every American embassy, for instance, now has a cyber working group, and anybody that has anything to do with cyber is in that room. I meet with them when I go to American embassies, and they tell me, oh, I'm working with this host nation partner. We're working with the British, we're working with the European Union. And so the coordination's really hard because there's a British effort and a EU effort and a German effort. So there's nobody to coordinate that necessarily, but there's a lot of cyber partnership going on overseas.
Thank you, Alex. Let's turn to Nadiya again, and again, the floor is yours on all those other issues. My question to you is, should we expect cyber escalation in Ukraine or even beyond, given the current battlefield dynamics and Putin's high stakes in the upcoming US election in particular? Thank you.
I would say no. I was going to say no, but listening to what Ambassador mentioned, I was like, who knows, right? I would expect, I would just expect sort of the same type of operations that we have seen so far. It could be very possible that Maybe Russia is buying a little bit more time to develop something more, a bit more sophisticated than DDoS attacks. But I would say I wouldn't be surprised that there could be some efforts put on the development of the influence operations, right, in the United States and in, basically various countries abroad. The question would be, and obviously those are not labeled as escalatory per se, but I would say probably we'll see more of the volume coming up. But the main question is like whether would these efforts make a difference in the elections? I would say very unlikely. They might create some friction. For instance, if they're going to be targeting states, the swing states like Georgia, for instance, right? There could be not even a cyber attack per se or influence operation, but there could be sort of, influence operation that would say, the elections are not legitimate because of some issues, etc. And then if the margin is very close, there might be a need for recount or something like this. But again, I wouldn't expect anything to make a change, make significant change in the elections, etc.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Tanel again. We talked a little bit about NATO earlier and cybersecurity. Now, at the 2021 NATO summit in Brussels, allies agreed that a cyber attack could be grounds to invoke Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty. Now, since then, coinciding with the Russia-Ukraine war, cyber attacks have significantly increased against NATO member states. And I think the figure that I have in my head is that DNS attacks against Estonia has increased something like 300% since last year. February, I could be completely wrong, but do you expect Article 5 to be invoked soon? And what would be the consequences of that? Thank you.
I mean, the question here is, what would constitute a big enough event so that allies would come together and decide now this is Article 5? And there is no clear answer, and there should not be a clear answer, because otherwise our adversaries would continue to go below the threshold. So it's a political question, and it's designed to be a political question throughout the years. So I don't have a clear answer to you. I mean, usually when we talk about the major attacks, do we talk about some major destruction, loss of lives? We'll always have to see every single case separately. And it's really up to the allies then to decide whether it's Article 5 or not.
Sure. I don't know if Alex or Nadiya, either of you also would like to add on to that or have particularly strong thoughts. Alex?
Sure. Article 5 is a political process. As the ambassador says, you are granted Article 5 by NATO. There have been some 6 or 7 requests for Article 5, one from Poland after the invasion of Ukraine, and several from Turkey when they've had attacks on Turkish soil or their aircraft shut down. And only once has Article 5 been invoked, and that's on behalf of the United States after 9/11. And so Article 5, any individual NATO member can veto an Article 5 declaration. So you actually have to convince all other 30 countries that your attack has been is important enough. But the first political decision that has to be made is by the targeted country. For instance, in Dusseldorf in 2019, 2020, a woman got killed because of ransomware in a hospital, and Angela Merkel very specifically did not decide to name that an armed attack in cyberspace. She said, well, she didn't say anything. So she avoided the topic of is this an armed attack? You've killed one of my citizens. You've attacked me under international law. She avoided the whole thing. Just didn't say anything about it. And so that's what, when you're the aggrieved party, they're the first ones who have to make the decision, and nobody's made that decision yet.
Thank you, Alex. That's really interesting. So it's the politics of Article 5 and cyber warfare neatly coming together there. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. I know some of you have meetings directly after this one, but I would like to thank all three of you, Professor Alex Crowther, Dr. Nadiya Kostyuk, and Ambassador Tanel Sepp, for your wonderful insights on this very timely discussion. Thank you also for our audience for joining us. Please join us for our next Russia-Ukraine dialogue and the impact of the war on the Balkans, which is slated for the 24th of October. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.